What's up?
How are you, Aaron?
Doing good, birthday boy.
Thank you. I wouldn't spend my birthday anywhere else in the world but with you.
Oh, so sweet. Thank you. Cheers to you.
Cheers. We're both drinking some Sauvignon Blanc, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it looks like yours is a little colder than mine. My glass isn't sweating.
I just poured it.
Nice. I took a couple pre-game sips though myself.
All right.
Well, cool. Welcome everybody. I think 4:04. I think we're going to get this show on the road a little bit. My name is Aaron Weinkoff, winemaker, vineyard manager at Spotswood, and I'm here with my friend Dan Petrosky from Larkmead. And it is actually his birthday today.
It is. No, I'm excited to be here. I mean, you know how much I love the estate. I love Beth and the Milliken family, and I've been a huge supporter. And your wines are probably the only wines I have of true vertical in the cellar for over 10 years. So I am just honored to be here hanging out with you guys and talking about this really important subject matter.
Nice, thanks. And yeah, bringing that back to the point, the subject matter is loosely going to be our version of yes, climate change is real, and yes, we are managing it and how we're managing it. So hopefully we'll have some good dialogue between the two of us. At the same time, there will be an opportunity for everybody to submit questions via the Q&A. I think you'll probably see the note off to the side that the chat, I believe, is going to be shut down for everybody. So everybody who has questions will have to submit it via the Q&A. Yeah, and so I guess without much avail, I'll just start by saying quickly, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, where we are, what we're doing, why, how we kind of see some of these things, but we'll try to keep that really abbreviated. I know we farm right around 38 acres right in the middle of St. Helena. We've been farming it organically since '85. And yeah, we've been seeing some dramatic differences kind of consistently. And this is something that we've been addressing in one form or another for over 15 years. Dan and I were talking about it a little bit earlier. And this is something that, yeah, it's not new. This is something that's just, you know, this has been progressive. Right now, it seems to be coming to a head, at least in the ethersphere and within the media. But at the same time, this is something on a day-to-day basis that we manage consistently. And share a little bit too about your reality, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I came out to Napa Valley in 2006, and I was given the opportunity to, I come from a completely different career and a different mindset and a corporate career, and I was given the opportunity to be the cellar master at Larkmead. And the only way I know how to do things from my perspective is to like think about, you know, the industry and think about the business of wine and think of it through a data analysis and a trend analysis. And so the first thing I did, I learned that we had weather stations. And so I started recording data. And then a couple of years later, there was a crazy article written by a very prominent wine climatologist out of Linfield College in Oregon. And he said that, you know, the greatest grapes in America are going to be grown in the Rocky Mountains by 2050. And I think everyone in Napa Valley was like, no, wait, we grow the greatest grapes in America. Like this is Napa Valley. We're experts in our field, and we are doing the best possible viticulture and farming and making the greatest wines. And so I was put on a panel, a small commission by the Napa Valley Vintners to kind of look at climate change during the late, 2009, 2010 era, and to kind of like look at it historically. So that was immediately back then, a little over 10 years ago, I got into this idea of how climate was important to our changing and evolution of who we are in Napa Valley. So it's been on my mind for quite some time, as you said, Aaron. You've been dealing with it on a daily basis. It's same thing for me. But the crazy thing about climate was when we went out as a committee and looked at all the old history of Napa Valley, and talked to the old farmers and asked them to share climate data with us, share interesting information about like the changing of the seasons, they didn't really have much information. They were recording that it rained in September. They didn't record how much it rained. They didn't record, exactly when it rained. So I thought it was very fascinating that I think that, today, as we look at climate because of our ability to see things in real time on an ongoing basis, there's a much more hypersensitivity to it. But does that mean it's not happening? No, it's happening, but there's a little greater hypersensitivity to data and data analysis. So that's something that I always have to kind of use as a balancing point in the pendulum when I think about climate.
For sure. And one of the things, just to give a few little bits of kind of generic data, the same climatologist that you were just referencing had also attended a lecture from him, and it's a little profound to realize that the 5 hottest years have all globally have all happened since 2015, and 9 of the last 10 have been the hottest in history. So it's something that we've certainly been dealing with, and I always like to remember that yes, we oftentimes get a little bit too focused on the idea that climate change is just global warming and things getting hot. Well, it's not the reality of it. The reality is it certainly can be a component of it, but all climatologists basically point to the idea that, the variables are going to become more variable. The extremes are going to become more extreme. The frequency of the exceptions are going to become more frequent. And so what we're facing, as a farmer, those are all things that you don't want to hear, because you want consistency, you want something you can plan for, don't want something that's going to thrust production back or forward in one way or another. So these are things that farmers at all levels are constantly trying to manage and manipulate. Certainly something we've been doing and have been doing, as I said, this is something that's been continuous for at least 15 years. People have been first watching the evolution as we transition to different rootstocks, and then starting to watch the transition into irrigation practices and refining irrigation practices and refining water use. And then actually, trellis modifications, heat modifications, shade cloths, misting, you name it. It's still everybody's trying to create a world in which the radical variables that we have to deal with, that Mother Nature gives us on a daily and yearly basis, can hopefully be managed for the sake of livelihoods and business.
Aaron, you hit the nail on the head. I think this concept of business and the variability and predicting your future as a farmer in an agricultural world, and you're thinking about the climate changing world, the economies are going to change our business. I'm a romantic at heart. I got into wine because of my romance and love of the history and the story of families and generational farming and generational winemaking. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to change us is when the farmers and the winemakers and the wine growers and the wineries lose money. That's what's going to change us. And look, we're not the only ones thinking about this. You can go to Wall Street right now and you can look at the greatest hedge funds in the world. You can look at BlackRock, who's moving away from fossil fuels and only investing in green energy. Like, this is, if you think about the future and the economy and where we have opportunity, the entire opportunity is in kind of green farming and green energy, and those are the things that are going to save agriculture. And at the end of the day, the wine industry is nothing but an agricultural business, and I think that's really important to understand as we think about, for the audience out there, if you're fans of our wineries, you drink our wines, the cost of goods for any winery is based on the yield of grapes, the barrels that we use, and the overhead that we have. The yield of grapes and the barrels that we use dominate the cost of our goods. So if the yields are down, Aaron, you don't change your farming practices in a year that Mother Nature says we're going to give you 20% less grapes. You don't change your farming practices in a year that they give you 20% more grapes. You still farm to the best of your ability at the same cost. So your cost is so super variable, as you said, as we see these extremes in Mother Nature. Like I was looking at the data. This is the funniest story because when I met my wife in 2009 and on a blind date in San Francisco.
I always get excited when you lead in with this is a good story, Dan.
No, I sold her on the idea that Napa Valley was this utopia. Like I was playing golf every week from 2007, 2008, 2009. It wasn't raining back then, like in those days, in that early 7, 8, 9 period. Like it never rained. I was playing golf every week, and I'm like, this place is great. It never rains. It does this. So she decides to move up to Napa Valley in the end of 2009, right at the beginning of the raining season. And it rained for 2 straight years. And she was like, what the fuck? You sold me a bill of goods. It's been raining every day for 2 straight years. And so that was and that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And we're
I'm going to call that bluff. It wasn't raining every day for 2 straight years. We're still pretty dry for 6 months of the year, buddy.
we are. But when you're trying to impress a girl, and she tells you it's raining every day, she's telling you it's raining every day.
Fair enough.
No, but we saw 150%. That's the crazy thing, Aaron, those variables. We saw 150% shifts in our rainfall calendar from 7, 8, 9 to 10, 11. And then we saw, we have that in 13, 14, 15. You mentioned, starting in 2015 is when we started to see the global climate change and shift. And we started to see these massive swings of rainfall. Yeah. And then you lose it for a couple of years, and now it's back again. 16, 17, 17, the largest amount of rainfall in California history.
Yeah.
Yeah, 71 inches.
And unfortunately, we have 1920 to balance that right back out.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it earlier. 2020 is the lowest recorded rainfall that I can record at Larkmeet's history. And Aaron, you suggested, and I'm talking only back to 2005 when I started recording data. But Aaron, you mentioned earlier that it goes deeper.
Yeah, I think it's one of the lowest in recorded Napa Valley history.
All right, so all right, let's get back to the nuts and bolts.
Exactly, the nitty gritty.
So we know the climate's going to change and it's going to shift, but what is it going to do to our wines?
Well, first I want to call you out because I think you've said something about the demise of Cab, and I think you probably overspoke that, and I want to give you an opportunity to pull your foot out of your mouth.
No, I will never do that. I'm not going to recount my words. I do believe that Cabernet is king. It's the wines, the base of the wines that really got me interested in wine in the late 90s and early 2000s were Cabernet based wines. And I will always love the wines of Bordeaux. I love the wines of Napa Valley. I'm fortunate to be, kind of the winemaker at one of the great estates and stewards of one of the great estates, oldest family estates in Napa. But I worry about Cabernet Sauvignon because I do feel that as a consumption.
What had been your exact words?
I do feel that Cabernet Sauvignon, even though it's currently the king, and I did say that the king has lost its crown, I do feel that Cabernet Sauvignon in our region is due for a massive kind of like chop at the knees. I think we have this opportunity to think about Cabernet, because Cabernet, if you look at the data, you look at Napa Valley, the amount of Cabernet that's been planted and harvested in Napa Valley just in the last 10 years has doubled. And that has put Cabernet Sauvignon into 50% or 51% of our total yield of the Napa Valley. And I think that's a reliance on a grape variety that is, and Aaron, I will quote you in saying, it is if you're going to bet on red or black, betting on Cabernet is not a bad idea. And I agree with you. Well, however, it's my fiduciary duty for business to think about the long-term health and future of the Larkmeet estate. If Larkmeet's celebrating its 125th anniversary this year, for the last 5 years, I've talked to Cam and Kate, the owners of Larkmeet, about what their plans for the next 125 years are. They're not going to be here. I'm not going to be here. I'm like, but what do we want to do? What do we want to think about? And if we're looking at a climate changing world, we have our fiduciary duty to think about how this place is going to evolve. We've proven that Napa Valley succeeds. Great.
And I'm going to interrupt you just to get a couple of words in. But yeah, as we had talked about, yes, CAB is king. I certainly mentioned that if I were betting on CAB, I mean, the structure, how the plant grows, its resiliency to pests and disease, these are all things that CAB kind of has in spades and really is an impressive grape. And yeah, it's certainly interesting when you look at those planting patterns and see that, you know, we're up to, CAB's now up to 51% of what Napa Valley is. That's still less than half. That speaks, or still, sorry, not less than half, about half. It speaks well to the varietal, and it probably speaks more perhaps to even the demise of other things like Merlot, which certainly had been planted in much more significant numbers, and both because of consumer preferences as well as the fact that it is a varietal that does not seem to manage and transition as well into the hotter climates that we've been seeing. So it in and of itself might be a very interesting examination of what these trends are and why so many people are continuing to plant CAB, aside from the fact that it is, of course, what is featured in the preeminent wines of the Napa Valley.
Yeah, but Merlot's a great example, and you know, and you've been to Bordeaux, and you know, you have friends there. I mean, I'm not French, but you know, I went to dinners and I've had meetings and I went to wineries and I visited over the last 5 years in the right bank of Bordeaux, where Merlot is the core, their essence, and they're at the same point in time. They're sitting there saying, everything we've done for the last 150 years, the 4, 5, 6, 7 generations of family farming is going to be lost because Merlot doesn't grow to the level, to what the tradition and the expectations of what we have of it. It's all about the expectation. It's about the expectation of our consumers, about the people who love Spotswood, the people who love Larkmead. It's about the expectations of what they want from us in the finished wine. My thoughts on Cabernet is that it doesn't need to be Cabernet, just like it doesn't need to be Merlot in the right bank. If you're a VCC lover and drink those wines religiously and buy them for your cellar and believe in the essence of what they do, it doesn't need to be Cabernet Sauvignon. I believe in the story. I believe in, this is my romance side of it. I believe in the story, and I believe in what that area can do, which is grow great grapes. Does it need to be Cabernet Sauvignon? No. In 1984, there was more French Colombard grown in California than Cabernet. You know, this is a very modern phenomenon. So my thoughts on it is that, like, I don't dislike Cabernet. I'm just saying, like, we need to be thinking about what we need to be considering, what this region can do, what our potential is, and it's an evolution.
Which brings us to some of the ideas that we've been having and some of what we've done. Obviously, being winemaker and vineyard manager, things that we've been doing in the vineyard, as I mentioned, you know, it's been pretty constant evolution, refining irrigation practices, buying shade cloths, starting to hang shade cloth, putting out misting systems, trialing different types of misting systems, seeing if we can get an evaporative cooling that will help moderate some of these extremes when they pop up in these given years. But all of that said, and I think one of the things that we said we would really focus on and talk about is this idea that I personally envision and see that CAB is going to be here and is going to be play a very, very big role in the current and future of the Napa Valley. And I'm quite happy with that because I find it a really amazing grape, and how we farm it and how we prune it. It's something that in and of itself just really has great structure physiologically out in the vineyard, and it really seems set up to manage all of these variables and these extremes. And I do just want to remind us that as we talk about this, it's the idea that there is there are more extremes. So with those more extremes, there are going to be years that are wet, years that are more dry, years that are hot, years that are cool. It's going to favor different pest pressures. Mildew pressures are going to change. So disease resistance, pest resistance, all of these things are going to become more and more important in trying to determine what is and how we are going to preserve the longevity of our vineyards, our businesses, and the valley as a whole. And so that really brings us to one of the things that I think everybody was interested in. Part of the reason why we're here to talk about it is that without discussing it with each other, we both kind of came to the conclusion that it was also a good time for us to start looking at trialing some other things out there. And so I'll stop myself there and just quickly ask what kind of brought you to that spot and where you're currently at.
Yeah, so we it goes back to my comments earlier about thinking about the Larkmead Estate and its 125th anniversary. And I always, I say this in a very critical way. Everyone has a birthday. It's my birthday today. Who gives a shit, right? But Larkmead turned 125 this year, and really, who gives a shit? It's about what you're going to do next and what you're going to do and plan for the future. And so for me, it was important to say that if Larkmead was going to last for another 125 years, what are we going to do to make that happen? And I thought that, we actually have a great history and a great past that actually did a lot of research and development. And Dr. Harold Omo, who was a UC Davis professor, planted Cabernet Sauvignon at Larkmead in 1939. Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't very popular in 1939, 1940, post the Depression, going into World War II. And so we had a lot of learning and a lot of history from then. So it was an opportunity for us to think about, well, in the next generation. And so we looked at, the history, we looked at the data, we looked at the science about climate and where we're going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years, because that's really when, as long as I'll be here, the owners will be here in their generational past to the kids. So we looked at the short term, the next 30 years, and all the science told us that, Cabernet is going to struggle a little bit. And the good thing about Napa Valley is we have these rules and regulations about how much Cabernet you need to put in a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet to be, considered Cabernet at 75%. So we can put in a little bit of Cabernet Franc, we can put a little bit of Merlot, Petit Syrah, Petit Verdot, whatever you want right now. So I thought about the other grape varieties that are succeeding in the world today, that are in warmer climates than Napa Valley is today. And that's usually the Southern Mediterranean. It's Portugal, it's Spain, it's, the south of France, south of Italy. It's in the Southern Hemisphere. I thought about those, but I also thought about the history of Napa Valley. We had over the course of 125 plus years, Larkmead has had over 30 grape varieties planted here. Some of those grape varieties, Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, Charbonneau, are very popular. Zinfandel and Petit Syrah is popular in the south of south of us. And those are going to be the things that are going to potentially kind of revisit. We're going to revisit over the course of the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, because our climate is, as we know, it's not just global warming. It's these extremes that are shifting. The planet, the jet streams are shifting. And we're talking about, what we know is going to happen in the next 20 years is Napa Valley is going to see an extreme in heat pressure, but it's going to be coming from a place that we already know exists, which is the Central Valley of California. It's going to shift its way up north. And that extreme pressure is going to put pressure on the qualities that we all love in Cabernet. The fruitfulness, the richness, the power, the structure, the balance, the elegance, all those things are going to be put under stress. And that's why I made it a point to think about how we can kind of, as an artist, look at a canvas and say, where do I need to add more purple? Well, I need a little of this and a little of that. I need a little of this, a little of that, and just kind of build a blossoming and beautiful picture.
So what did you pick?
So so a big thing, as I said, I'm a sales and marketing and finance guy from corporate America in the past, and I need to think about what's going to sell, and what are you thinking about when if Napa Valley is putting its flag on Cabernet Sauvignon, which a lot of people have, the Andy Beckstoffers of the world, and God bless them, but what I said to myself was, if you're really going to buy Spotswood and you're really going to buy Larkmead, you're pretty dialed in with like great wines of the world. Like you should be. I mean, you're spending enough money and in buying our wines and being a collector, and researching and doing development. So I looked at, what I thought to be some of the greatest wines produced in the world. And I looked at Vega Sicilia in Spain, and they're a Tempranillo based wine, Tempranillo and Cabernet. They have a second label, Tempranillo and Merlot. I looked at Barcavella, which is a Portuguese winery that's a subset of another winery that produces a wine in only the best vintages. They produce less than Champagne Salon did over the course of the last 100 years. They only produce about 26 vintages, and that is a Trigo Nacional based wine. And I looked at Mastro-Bardino. I love Italian. I spent a year of my life living in southern Italy. Mastro-Bardino and Aglianico, that's a grape variety that in the 1968 vintage probably made the greatest wines in the world. So if you look at Vega Sicilia, Mastro-Bardino, Barcavella, those three wineries alone, in my opinion, are in the top 25 wineries of all time. And they produce the greatest wines of all time. Napa Valley built our entire industry on the Chateau model of Bordeaux, and we're trying to recreate the Bordeaux Chateau model and creating these great expressions of these Bordeaux grape varieties, Cabernet Merlot and Cabernet Franc. Well, I think we can probably create the greatest expression of Spanish Tempranillo, the greatest expression of Portuguese Touriga Nacional, the greatest expression of Aglianico. I'm just arrogant in that sense, but I also feel that Napa Valley has the climate and the opportunity and the terroir and the soils and the expertise. Aaron, you nailed all the viticultural practices we do. We can do all this, and we can do it better than anyone else because we have a utopia here in Napa that we can grow great grapes.
Got it.
Doesn't need to be Cabernet.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm just going to say one thing because I've been watching some of these questions coming in. We are going to try to continue with the conversation and then answer some of the questions later on. So sorry if we're not answering them immediately. We'll hopefully get to them, and we have somebody behind the scenes that'll help us get through those. And so yeah, back to the conversation. I think you mentioned a handful of the varieties. My guess is if I remember correctly, you have a few more varietals on your short list, but I'm not going to let you talk for a few minutes. So yeah, I mean, we came to the same conclusion that we have an opportunity right now. We kind of see the writing on the wall. We see things change, and it's something that, if nothing more, we believe in the theory, the science, the practice of trialing some of these things, preparing ourselves, trying to get ahead of the curve, in case we do start seeing either varietals struggle, rootstock struggle, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been something that we've started a rootstock plan and have been planting rootstock trials basically since 2011. We have 10 primary rootstocks planted here on the property, and we have 14 additional rootstocks in the trials that will all help us really understand each of these rootstocks. I know generically, I feel like I've started to already see some of the failings of some of the weaker rootstocks or more moderate growing rootstocks, 3309, 10114, that were planted quite a bit in the 2000s. And so right now, I personally fall in that category of wanting to plant things that are as vigorous as basically possible, because you can't replace vigor. It's really hard when you have a very dry year to coax out vigor from a vineyard. Whereas we have so many wonderful tools with cover crops that in the long run are probably better for the soils anyways, that are much easier to utilize and maintain when we're trying to look for moderation of vigor. So there's a lot more tools out there and a lot more that can be done to moderate that vigor in those extreme conditions. So, we've been focusing on our rootstock trial to begin with, and then we've now progressed into finally a varietal trial that we started. This has been something that's been in works and discussions for about 5 years. We planted the vineyard last year to rootstocks and have just finished grafting everything over. But for us, some of the things you talked about, Dan, I was not actually looking at any special houses. This is this is something that is experimental. I don't need to pretend that we're not encumbered or beholden to any one region. It's always been the luxury of California. So many people that when they moved here and started growing grapes, they brought their traditions from their countries, whether it was Hungary, Spain, Italy, France, or their own biases. And now we're California's younger. We've been experimenting for 30 years. We've certainly galvanized around a number of varietals, but we're still unencumbered by necessity or expectations. So there was a lot of freedom there for me to think about and kind of choose what we were looking for. And I was looking at it, I realize it's pretty generic, but it's slightly scientific in its way. I was looking at it going, well, in really hot years, what can be compromised? Tannin, structure, acid, color could all be compromised in really hot years. In really wet years, what are the biggest challenges? Virus, thin skins, mildew pressures, etc. Cool vintages, what kind of fruit profile are you going to get? Warm vintages, what kind of fruit profile are you going to get? And really looking at something that, throwing back to that same appreciation that you talk about of, what is a little bit of Napa's history, our ability to, what we refer to as, old school Napa blacks, what these old varietal wines were, oftentimes co-planted and co-fermented. They were blends, and thinking that, this trial is it's going to shed light. It's going to shed light on how grapes themselves are going to transition with the period, how these other varietals are going to be able to step up. And yes, taking for granted that many of them are selected because they can handle the higher heats instead of going with something like Pinot that we know is just not going to be able to manage those higher heats. So as I was putting it together, there was certainly a thought that, a couple high color semi-teinturiers or teinturiers were great. And so we selected Alicante Bouschet, we selected Suzao. Looking at a couple of the hybrids that have been, were basically bred back in France in the 50s, and thinking that in and of themselves, Marcelin and Irene Arnoa were really interesting. They have interesting lineage, interesting parentage, and everything points to them being a pretty well-balanced, well-structured, thicker skin, more disease-resistant varietal that still has a lot to do. And these were things that we've gone out, we've tried to taste examples of all of these wines to make sure we're not completely just walking off a cliff blindly. And feeling somewhat confident in those decisions, but also still keeping in mind that, initially maybe this becomes just a mixed black blend for the short term and long term. It's going to inform us in everything that we do. And then a couple old school Napa Valley workhorses like Carignan, Mourvedre, Petit Syrah, and there was one question that came across of whether we were going to keep Petit Syrah. Yes, and there's a lot of reasons not to. It struggles with heat, despite having good color, and it's not tremendously thick-skinned and has botrytis issues and has sunburn issues, et cetera, et cetera. But that was still kind of keep paying homage to both the history of the other vineyard that we took a lease out on, as well as being able to pair that with some of the history, Mourvedre, Carignan practices. And then we decided to go ahead and throw a few whites in there too, but we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, we need to talk about whites, because I know how much white wine you produce every year, and I know how much white wine I produce every year. It's really important to kind of have that conversation too, because we don't want to be, hey, we might end up being just a red wine community. That's nothing wrong with that. There's just
but that's not true. I mean, and that's why I think that's why we also tend to not, and this was something that we were going to talk about earlier, we'll talk about it right now. I think we tend to focus on reds more than anything because they're a little bit easier to manage through that most delicate time. Oftentimes we're picking whites at 22 Brix, 23 Brix max. We're not pushing our whites, at least stylistically, we're not pushing our whites to 25, 26 Brix. They're white. They remain more photosynthetic. They remain more resilient to heat. And so we don't deal with the same struggles of berry shrivel. We don't have to deal with a tannin maturation like we do on reds. So how we manage whites and how we're able to farm whites is going to continue to give us huge windows of opportunity and choice as we move forward, because it's really as we move into those late phases of ripening where we're seeing the damage that heat and sun can do to the fruit when they're red fruits, that I think is going to be is the biggest, most delicate period that we're talking about, and why we put so much focus on that.
So, Aaron, how could you justify the farming practice? So, if you're, and I agree 100% on everything you're saying about white wine grapes and where they are, but as we think about the land of Napa Valley, the cost of the land, the cost of the farming, you don't do much different to your Sauvignon Blanc grapes than you do to your Cabernet Sauvignon grapes in the farming process. You're organically farmed, biodynamically farmed. You may be setting a yield that's double what you normally see from Cabernet Sauvignon, but your Sauvignon Blanc pricing is a fifth or a fourth of what you charge for your Cabernet Sauvignon. So how can you balance the future of Napa Valley based on your current farming practices and adding in the shade cloth, adding in the misters, adding in all the climate change variations, when white wine has a value and a perceived value that's so much lower than a red wine grape like Cabernet Sauvignon or a red wine from Napa Valley? I'm like, that's where I struggle. And then you add in like that we might be planting something different than Sauvignon Blanc, which is Sauvignon Blanc is, the second most consumed white wine variety in America behind Chardonnay.
No,
If you start throwing Albarino in there, like how are you going to convince someone to pay $45 or $40 for an Albarino from St. Helena?
well, I guess first of all, I would just say, we're not going out and wholesale replanting all reds to whites. So part of that argument for me is not necessarily legitimate. Yeah, when it's certainly a valid point where and how we've evolved to where we are at, financially and cost wise, is a story that took 40 years to develop, and I don't think that it's going to be rewritten overnight. And I'll be certainly curious to see how everything transitions. My guess is if I knew what those exact answers were, I would probably not be here, and I would probably be in a very different position. But I am not. And again, this goes back to, it's not a wholesale discount. I'm not saying the world is falling. I'm not saying Cab has lost its crown or, is tarnished. I'm just saying, and in practice, what we're going out and we're just looking at saying, hey, we want to continue to watch these other things. We've already passed our judgments on Pinot in Saint Helena. We've already passed some of our judgments on Merlot in Saint Helena. Let's not pull the blinders over our eyes and move forward faithfully. Let's just continue to open our minds, keep our eyes open, evaluate all of these things, and try to manage as best we can, and give ourselves as many tools as we can. Because back to your comment about the finances, we happen to have the luxury of being able to embrace and evaluate those tools. Somebody that's farming 38 acres in Fresno would not have the same luxuries because the finances just do not support it. Maybe the big boys do because they have R&D budgets, but somebody our size certainly would not be able to. And so it's absolutely a luxury have, but it's a necessary due diligence that I feel like we need to do on all fronts. We have to keep our minds open and consider everything.
No, I agree, and I think the opportunities that we have are about this evolution, this changing world, and who is drinking our wines and how they're drinking and how they're perceiving it. And a question came through about Cabernet fatigue. Are we having Cabernet fatigue? I don't really believe in Cabernet fatigue because I don't really believe in Cabernet. I believe in Napa Valley. And to me, that is like, I believe in what Napa Valley created in the last 30 years, as you designated a time period earlier, Aaron. Like, we created a style of wines in this valley that are delicious and that people want to drink. And in some instances, they're not 100% Cabernet. They might be 75% Cabernet. They can change and adjust. And I think we'll continue to create deliciousness in the valley, and we'll continue to grow great grapes. I just think that we don't need to, if your marketing plan is to be solely based on Cabernet Sauvignon, then I think you may have a problem in 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
I think the runway is not that long for the future of Cabernet in Napa Valley. Is the runway, eternity for Napa Valley growing great grapes? Yes. It's just, we need to evolve. We're still such a young, infantile, embryonic view of what we can do here very well, because we've changed so much over the last 110 years of grape growing in the Napa Valley.
And I still kind of disagree with you. I mean, I continue to think that, Cab, the reason why Cab has become so predominant in the valley was not for any other reason than this is the cream that floats to the top in a given area. Other growing regions went through this process hundreds of years ago. We've gone through this process in the last 50 years or 100 years. Obviously, there's been a lot more planted. We've had things planted since the mid to late 1800s. So it's absolutely been evolving, and this is why things have developed. It's why we have so much Cabernet here in the north of the valley, and it's why there's much less down south as you move into Carneros. But I would also say too that agriculture doesn't move as fast as the media. And it seems like more and more, nothing moves as fast as the media almost. It still takes 5 years to plant a block and really get it to true production. And there are ways of pushing that a little bit and doing that a little bit quicker, but generically that's what happens. And then when you start talking about wines that, takes years to evaluate, I just think it's always important to remember where we are at within the paradigm, and remember that we have to be patient. We have to be looking ahead. We have to be planning ahead. But we also know that our industry, what we're working with, is not going to change overnight. We are going to learn, and I've even had this thought about my choice of Falangina as a white. Whether it was the best or worst idea, we'll find out. But the reality is if it doesn't pan out, we can graft over to something else.
So this is interesting, Aaron, and I'm going to put you on a spot here, because you say you don't agree with me on the future of Cabernet, but why are you doing all this viticultural research with other grape varieties? I mean, you actually, above and beyond any other Napa Valley producer, you actually, as a winery, invested in working with, I think you worked with Columbia on this, on the Lamont Doherty, the NASA, like to think about, to look at your region and look at where you are in this microclimate of St. Helena, is to see where you're trending. And so if you believe in the future of Cabernet as this long-term thing, and trust me, I want to be wrong about this, but why are you considering all these other options?
Again, it's with the idea of being prepared. I already have 30 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon, so I'm going to be able to watch Cabernet and know exactly what Cabernet is doing, and it is going to continue to be the heart of what we do. We have Cab Franc planted, we have Petit Verdot planted, we pulled Merlot out years ago, decades ago. I still, at heart, very much believe in the idea of blends, and that we're stronger together, holding hands, than we are trying to go it alone. And I think some of the modern perversions of single varietal wines are perhaps not the most complex or best examples of what I think of as some of the best wines in the world. So I absolutely believe in blends. And therefore, I look at it like that. You know, if at one point in time somebody has to make the decision that they're going to have a proprietary blend instead of a single varietal Cabernet, a single varietally labeled Cabernet Sauvignon, that's a choice that they're going to be able to make, and they're going to be able to make that, you know, as they're evolving. But at the moment, it's certainly not necessary. And having a good idea of how these other varietals are going to be doing and be able to consider them as part of the blending tool. Again, even if, you know, I still foresee cab being a very significant part of the future, and in everything, in all of its growing patterns and structures. You know, I think it's very well prepared for the future. I mean, you look at what we already went through with the extremes of 2017. I mean, the extremes of 2017 were significant, and what cab was able to do, what our cab was able to do, was quite good, and feel quite happy with that.
No, and I think about you guys in the same way I think about all those estates that came before us in the grand scheme of Napa Valley, maybe not in time, but in actually presence. But I think of Screaming Eagle, I think of Opus One, I think of Dominus, I think of Harlan, and those wines are not labeled Cabernet Sauvignon. They're labeled Napa Valley red wine. And so when I think of Spotswood, I think of Spotswood, the estate. I don't think of Cabernet. I know you produce Cabernet, and I know that Screaming Eagle is Cabernet, and I know that Harlan has a base of Cabernet. I know that Opus is a base of Cabernet, but I think of those properties just like I would think of you know, a Chateau model, a Bordeaux model. But my take on it is like, we just need to keep making a better widget or a better shoe or a better wine, and it just has to fall under the realm of its Larkmead or Spotswood or Opus or Harlan or the Eagle. And I think that's where I think once we do it, and I actually got really upset once with a climate conference we held here at Larkmead a year ago. I got upset with a buddy of ours, Nate Weiss, who's a winemaker at Silver Oak, and I was like, you know, Nate, if anyone can change the world on Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa Valley, it's Silver Oak. You guys have such a presence in the world as Silver Oak, the greatest name for a wine brand ever, in my opinion. Like, you guys don't need to be Cabernet focused, but they are, and they make so much of it, and they do it so well. And I'm like, you could bring the entire audience of Napa Valley wine drinkers to the next level of climate change, to the next level of the future, because you guys have such an commanding presence in the world and in our, you know, domestic drinking culture. And I was just like, I'm gonna work really hard to make sure that, you know, you guys use your power for good, and they do. I mean, the amount of, you know, green, you know, LEED certified buildings and green, you know, farming and so forth is just incredible, and I think they're doing amazing stuff. But I think that we need to, you know, as you said, Aaron, earlier, we need to kind of be together. We need to hold hands, and we need to kind of walk into this future together, because that's what's going to keep these businesses alive. That's going to keep Spotswood going to the next generation, to keep Larkmead going to the next generation, is that we do this together. Because I do really, truly believe that if we have this reliance on this single thing, look what COVID did to us. All the wineries that had reliance on being a restaurant-only wine or a DTC tasting room-only wine, because you have tourists in Napa Valley, or retail-only wine, you kind of got screwed. If you rely on one single thing, and a climactic event like COVID is going to destroy your business.
Well, on that light note, let's be respectful of everybody's time. I know we're at 4:52. 50 minutes just blew by. I don't know how it goes so quickly, but I know there's a few questions over here that we want to try to get to and see if we can. Do you want to take the ones addressed to you, or I'll just give a couple about, here's a couple about our personal weather stations, analyzing them, mining them for a little bit of data. Yeah, I think we both have weather stations going back quite a while. And certainly we're working with a number of people Yeah, already starting to starting to mine that data. So those we can certainly be asked about those separately. Another question: what is the future of Cab Franc in Napa? Um, do you have opinion? I have a definite opinion.
I think it's a sexy variety of the moment. I don't think it's a future. I don't think it has a future here.
I apparently like disagreeing with Dan because I do. It's you know here's one of those ancient varietals lineage a parent to Cab Sauv, and it is an oddball. It is a varietal that shows stress out in the vineyard in very interesting ways. It continues to function. It continues to surprise me how well it actually is able to tolerate heat. And so I don't by any means discount it. There aren't many places that feature it. A lot of places that feature it and tend to try to make it more like Cab Sauv and you know over concentrated, over extracted, and so I personally fall in the category of finding Cab Franc just a really beautiful complement, a really beautiful blender to another one of to Cab and anything else out there, and continue to think that as we're talking about these things and looking at these things as being blends and blenders and watching them into the future, that it will remain legitimate. Let's see here. Next question. What varietals do you think can best withstand heat and drought as well as likely atmospheric river levels of rainfall? Um,
Atmospheric river levels of rainfall. I'm going to use that in some capacity
yeah.
at some point in time.
And,
That's awesome.
oh, and the rest of that question, and still reflect house styles.
That's I mean, how style goes back to sense of place. It goes back to soils. You know, the one thing that we have to remember in a climate changing world is that soils don't change in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, a millennia. That soils don't change. And I think that's the most important thing that we have to understand is that, you know, a young variety planted in Larkmead, whether it be Tempranillo or Touriga Nacional, is going to smell and taste like Tempranillo or Touriga Nacional. But over 20, 30, 40 years in the ground, I hope that it starts to smell and taste like Larkmead. And I think that's what we have to be thinking about when we think about our brand, when we think about what we put in bottle. I'm not putting Touriga in a bottle versus Cabernet in a bottle and asking you to pay, you know, the same price for it. I'm putting Larkmead in a bottle, and I think that's the most important thing that we can do. And you know, I think one thing that I've planned with our climate project is it's a 21-year project, to 7 years each time. To your points of, can you go from drought and really high intense heat, but then all of a sudden go to, you know, rivers falling on the earth? That's something that we're going to learn over these kind of 3 segments, these 7-year increments of like replanting grape varieties, because we have to plant for these extremes and find those grape varieties that can do that. And there's not a lot of grape varieties that can do those extremes quite yet. So that might be a new future development.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go back to what I said. You know, we still have cover crops. We have a lot of other things that help us manage, you know, higher rainfalls. We have other tools that exist, and they're also not going anywhere. So by selecting varietals and selecting practices that will hopefully just give us a more dynamic response mechanism to these changes is the only goal, and as much as you can hope for, because it's not like change is going anywhere. Change is a very present part of our lives, especially in farming. Let's see here. That covers that. I think I saw another question come through here in regards to Sauvignon Blanc. I'm looking for it. Just talking about whites. We touched on it a little bit. I think whites, there's a little bit more luxury in how that's going to be able to manage late season heat in some of the most challenging, delicate periods of the year. We've already seen good success and continue to think that Sauvignon Blanc is really amazing considering its fresh climate aromatics. You pick it a little bit more you pick it a little bit lower sugars, you pick it a little bit earlier, and it still shows fresh Sauvignon Blanc characteristics and aromatics. So it and many others are going to continue to be very viable options.
I agree with Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, it's one of the most noble grape varieties on the planet. I mean, it's grown successfully in New Zealand and South Africa, in the Loire Valley, in Friuli, in Bordeaux, in Napa. You can't name another grape variety that has successfully traveled the world as much as Sauvignon Blanc has done in different growing conditions. So I think Sauvignon Blanc has a future and will continue to have a future here in Napa.
Here's a question I think we can answer quickly. How much of your pontification on warm and hot climate growing varietals has been tested against the soil, terroir, and mesoclimate of Napa? Not much. That's why we're doing this.
Yeah. Half of the grape varieties that we're planting at Larkmead for the future have been planted at Larkmead over the last 125 years. Zinfandel, Petite Sirah, Charbonneau, and Chenin Blanc. Those were all planted at Larkmead 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we're now bringing them back because we think that it's all about timing. It's about the right time at the right place, the right place, the right time. And we think the future is now for those grape varieties. It wasn't back then.
Yep. Here's a question. Is Bordeaux diversifying? I realize the climates are different, but they're so steeped in tradition. Would be interesting if they are. Yes, they've accepted seven new varietals into their accepted varietal list. I believe 2 of them are whites and 5 of them are reds. Marselan, Arine, Arnoa, which happen to have been on our list, happen to have been incorporated into their list, as well as a few other varietals. So they're very much cognizant of this and very much working on many of the same things that we are. Even though we're starting from being basically a Winkler Zone 4 and they're starting from being a Winkler Zone 2/3. So the ceilings for us are in slightly different places, I would say.
Yeah, agreed.
Let's see here, 5 o'clock. Well, I think we might have to cut it off there. We will, as usual, try to go through these and try to get out some, if we can get out other questions and have the opportunity to do so. I think we'll certainly look through these and do so. But in the meantime, I just want to say to all of you, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is obviously something we both care a lot about and have been working hard on. And yeah, I appreciate this. And Dan, of course, it's always good to see you and chat with you.
Love to see you too, Aaron. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. And yeah, let's cheers to Napa Valley and its future.
Yep, and have an awesome weekend. Thanks.
Good night.